Episode 6, Corn, The Journey of Maize. Hello, and welcome to the History of American Food. This week, I'll be looking at the journey the grass teosinte took from somewhere around Oaxaca State in Mexico to become corn in the British New World. So pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. It turns out that 9,000 years of corn history has had a whole new dimension added to it in the past 2 decades. 21st century DNA detective work, paired with an increase of interdisciplinary work between scientific specialties, means some lingering holes in the story of corn have started to be filled in. Which means, yes, it will be a whole episode on the history of corn, and I get to bust out my scientific paper reading skills, which is clearly more exciting to me than it is to you. In order to keep track of all of the peregrinations of this week's food, I had to draw a map. I've posted it along with pictures of ancient, middle, and early modern corn examples, all at thehistoryofamericanfood.blogspot.com. First, let's tackle that name, corn. When Columbus brought the first ears back to Queen Isabella, he introduced it as Maize, a word adopted from the Arawak language families he encountered in the Caribbean. And it's the name corn still lives under in Spanish, French, Italian, and German. On the other hand, when the English arrived in the New World, they saw the locals eating a grain in porridges, so they just started calling it Indian corn. This happened because the word corn is simply the English word from somewhere in the Middle Ages that was used the way modern Americans currently use the word grain. Wheat, barley, rye, and oats, these were all corn. So when you see stuff about the Corn Laws and the 1840s Irish famine, the corn they are talking about is actually wheat, barley, and oats, no ears of corn at all. So really, the English were all, oh, you have a grain, and we call you Indian, so we'll call it Indian grain. Except the word they used was corn. In its travels, this grain goes by as many names as cultures it passed through on its way to meet the English colonists. But since this is a podcast on U.S. American food, and modern Americans call it corn, I will simply stick with the name corn. But we are not done with languages and names. The earliest evidence of domestication and cultivation of the grass that would become corn have been found in southwest Mexico, around Oaxaca State, sort of inland of Acapulco, if that helps. Originally, this grass, teosinte, looked like a single short row of kernels stacked atop each other. You can go look at teosinte in the wild even now. It's still out there. Each seed was sealed tightly in its own individual shell. In order to get at the nutritious seed inside, the tough casing had to be broken open or removed, just as we get rid of the inedible chaff from other cereal grains like wheat, barley, rice, so on. The seeds of this ancient corn, teosinte, have a high moisture content when dried compared to most grains. So when heated, it would pop out of those tough shells, a bit like modern popcorn. Food historians speculate this is how the early grains might have been consumed. And don't tell me some bored children of the past weren't goofing off around a fire after being told to stop bothering the grown-ups and go entertain themselves, and got this to happen with some dry teosinte heads. But how did this grass turn into the cob we know today? Some observant plant cultivation geniuses of the past spied variants of teosinte with more rows of seeds growing around a central core, or maybe some of the seeds poked out of the tough shells, and they started growing these on purpose. These oddball teosinte were a better food, more seeds for less effort. Over time, plants with mutations that resulted in less outer coat and more seeds were selected and domesticated, until that tough outer coat was gone and all of the grains were enclosed by one big husk. Now it was something even a child could strip off to get at rows and rows of rich, nutritious grains. The full change happened slowly, likely sprinkled with a few remarkable leaps forward. While evidence of how long ago humans started consuming the grass is pretty impossible to pin down, evidence of the cob, in much smaller versions, is firmly established by about 9,000 years ago. And that is when the plant really started to travel. The corn cob, even in its smaller version, was a breakthrough in the grain world. The work needed to get at each little seed suddenly became tiny. If you think of the effort needed to break wheat or rice out of their hulls and then separate the chaff, when every single step of grain processing was done by muscle power alone, it makes sense that corn spread so quickly in every place it was introduced. An entire, tedious, repetitive, and exhausting step in food preparation had been removed. Protecting the desirable corn types and controlling crosses, something any plant cultivating culture understands well, was reasonably easy in corn's new naked grain iteration. The way corn plants are constructed makes it very easy to take control of the pollination process. Unlike the flowers most of us were introduced to in biology class, where the male pollen-containing stamen and the female egg-containing pistil are all packaged together, on corn plants there are separate male and female flowers on entirely different parts of the stalk. Corn is not alone. Many other plants, like squashes, have separate male and female flowers. Some plants even go so far as to make entirely separate male and female bushes or trees. This is why only some holly bushes have berries, and why so many cities have such horrid pollen problems. But I digress. In corn, the pollen is way up at the top of the plant and can be easily covered and collected with a bag. The silk is down below along with the central stalk. Captured pollen can be hand-brushed onto emerging silk. This makes it pretty easy to control crosses between plants with desirable characteristics, or to protect corn varieties from outcrossing, that is, being pollinated by some other random corn. Wild teosinte was often hanging around the edges of cornfields, so there was always likely to be some wild backcrossing. But people hand-pollinating their corn with their preferred pollen would prevent most of that. Corn can and does wind pollinate, especially when planted in large fields. But when corn is your lifeline and keeping varieties distinct matters, it is not hard to see why hand pollination would be part of the cultivation. Even now, gardeners who are growing a small patch of corn will hand pollinate to get better yields. But the wild crosses wouldn't be eliminated. And since the earliest corn cultivators clearly had some serious botany chops, they were likely always to be looking for more lucky accidents. Corn is the grain that has the widest growing range in terms of latitude, from Lima, Peru in the south, all the way up to southern Canada in the north, and everywhere in between. Which means corn has adapted to a wide range of day lengths, soil conditions, water availability, rain patterns, and temperature ranges. If you look at the genetic dissimilarity of any two corn varieties, they vary as much as two hominids separated by 3.5 million years of time. And yet, any two varieties of corn can cross to produce fertile seeds, as can modern corn with its forebearer teosinte. Yet two closely related mammal species with less genetic diversion will usually produce either no offspring or infertile offspring. For example, horses and donkeys producing infertile mules. How is this possible? At first glance, you'd think clearly corn is less complex than a person. After all, corn has 10 pairs of chromosomes, while humans have 23 pairs, thus 23andMe. But on those 20 discrete chunks of intricately wound DNA, corn has about 32,000 genes, as opposed to the human 20,000. I acknowledge the number is hotly debated, but it seems to be the current consensus. When it comes to plants, their genes are organized a bit differently than animals. They have to carry around the genetic supplies to deal with environmental changes. When animals face a change in the environment, they can move or alter the location as humans have. But plants have to be ready to adapt more or less in place. Corn can even move genes around in their chromosomes more than animals can. so they have a vaster toolkit to face these challenges they can't move away from. Yes, corn is very, very adaptable. It self-adapts to survive different growing conditions, and people adapt it to their different needs. Examples of the array of corn shapes, sizes, and colors are available in the show notes. So how did this corn get from southern Mexico out to the 17th century British Atlantic colonists? For a while, the common narrative was something along the lines of, the Aztecs grew it, the Maya grew it. There are stone carvings in the Amazon, so it went there. It also went to the southwest, something, pilgrims. And people would sort of mumble about Columbus when you'd ask about polenta, and then they'd just go cross-eyed and walk away if you asked what was up with cornstarch and Chinese sauces and those baby corns and Thai food. But at last, the research is catching up to the questions. A project to get a full DNA sequence for corn got going in the last few years of the 20th century. Then automation and information processing picked up speed in the 21st century. Archaeology, archaeolinguistics, paleobotany, and genetic detective work all started getting together over corn. And the cooperation has started turning out papers since the 2010s on where corn went, how it got there, and what it did once it arrived. Pretty exciting stuff. Archaeologists were turning up corn cobs, pots with corn residues, and other artifacts with corn art. Palynologists, people who study ancient pollen, were getting genetic material. And archaeolinguists were studying how words for corn traveled through languages. And then there's the approach of listening to and having conversations with the members of the American tribes who have been husbanding these corn strains since they arrived in the future U.S. I was fortunate enough to get my head pointed in the right direction by chef and indigenous food educator Dave Smoke McCluskey, who is also a member of the Mohawk tribe and lives in South Carolina. As part of his work to keep corn knowledge a living, breathing part of the modern food scene, his corn mafia also sells hominy, grits, flour, and occasionally masa made from these pre-colonial corn strains. You have to plant it and grow it to keep the seeds alive. As a result, we now have a much better travelogue for corn from its starting point in southwestern Mexico. The first journey seems to have been south, through Central America, down to the western Amazon basin. Cultivated corn was definitely in the Amazon by 7,500 years ago. By then, the Amazon basin already had a thriving plant cultivation culture. Cassava, squash, and rice, a South American endemic variety, Oryza rufipogon, were already domesticated in that area. Similar age corn has been found in Peru, showing that it traveled south, both east and west of the Andes. From the Amazon basin, corn migrated out to the east coast of South America to the south side of the Orinoco River. And from there it seems to have migrated up the chain of the Lesser Antilles. Yet another offshoot headed east on the Yucatan Peninsula. Another line of corn, at least 5,000 or 6,000 years old, came with a group of people who migrated east along the north side of the Orinoco River through modern-day Colombia and Venezuela. And that corn seems to be the corn, along with its humans, that headed across Cuba and through the Greater Antilles. Corn DNA detective work on both sides of the Atlantic has shown that this seems to be the corn Columbus found on Hispaniola and brought back to Spain. The Portuguese, who were issued Brazil by the Treaty of Tordesillas, seem to have picked up the Amazon basin corn when they started importing corn from Brazil to Europe and West Africa. I haven't been able to find which strains went to China with either the Spanish or Portuguese in the 16th century. This plant detective work is all pretty recent, and it takes a while for some things to filter out into English. It may also be that the original strains that went to China have been fully replaced by more modern types. Meanwhile, back in Mexico, the northward moving corn traveled along the Sierra Madre Mountains, some on the Pacific coast side and some through the highlands of the eastern side of the range. The Pacific coast side seems to have stopped traveling somewhere around the north end of Baja, but the corn on the east side of the mountains kept going until it made it to the region of modern Arizona and New Mexico around 4,000 years ago. Of note, the words for corn in the dry Southwest are markedly different than the Mayan and Arawak-related words, leading researchers to believe that corn, at this point, was traveling without its people. Instead, it had become a trade good. A vibrant corn culture would grow up among the saguaros and pronghorns of the Southwest. About 2,000 years ago, some of the Pacific Coast corn would enter the mix, and then corn would continue its journey east. Somewhere right around the year 0, as we switch from BCE to CE, or the Common Era, corn would start to move north into the plains and east into the Mississippian societies. It seems that nearly all cultures would happily add this cooperative and highly adaptive crop to their main seed foods of sunflower and goosefoot. Modern eaters are more likely to recognize the goosefoot varieties known as amaranth and quinoa. Modern gardeners see it as a weed, despite it being a nutritious edible. It is worth noting that where corn thrived, monumental cultures would arise. In South America, the Aztecs, the Maya, the Inca, and the Olmec all built stone structures that persist thousands of years later. You can visit the stone cities of the Anasazi high in the cliffs of Colorado and in the rest of the Four Corners area. The pueblos the Spanish explorers found in the Southwest and moved into in the 16th century and beyond, some are still inhabited and functioning even today. And the mound building of the Mississippian culture still marks the landscape from Illinois all the way to Florida. Corn would head towards the East Coast in a plethora of varieties. Strains would head towards future New England under the Great Lakes and north of the Platte and Missouri rivers, while other strains would travel closer to the Gulf of Mexico through Oklahoma and Missouri towards the southeast. The complex political and trading relationships of tribes along the East Coast would produce a sort of new mixing bowl of corn. Varieties moved up and down the connected societies with other trade goods, news, and technology. They would produce a wide range of brilliantly colored varieties, each carrying a name in its own language. And different corns would have different roles. Some were best for early planting and might be preferred boiled as whole cobs and eaten as a vegetable. Others might be best for roasting, and yet others might be best to grow large for drying or parching, or later use as hominy or flour. In some ways, corn can seem like the perfect food. So much more for less work. But there is this chemistry trick that corn plays, and you can't treat corn just like any other grain. If you do, it will hold something back. Despite losing the really tough outer skin, corn still has a pretty hardy shell, or pericarp, over the endosperm and germ, the inside part of the corn. To get at all the proteins, sugars, starches, and fats inside, this must be pierced or removed. In corn eaten fresh, like baby corns, corn on the cob, or cut corn, the pericarp is soft enough for our puny human teeth and single-step digestive tract to do away with. But once you get into dry corn, you have to physically break the kernels and blow away the pericarp, as is done with corn for polenta and coarse cornmeal. Or the corn needs to be soaked in a basic or alkaline solution and rubbed or agitated to remove the pericarp. When corn is eaten fresh or simply cracked, there is some nutrition there, but really the riches of the corn are still sequestered in its heart. If you have a varied diet that includes other protein sources beyond corn, eggs, dairy, meat, beans, and so on, you're good. But if you're reduced to corn and a bit of foraged fruit and vegetables, there's a problem. On its own, corn is not a complete protein for humans. Notably, it is missing niacin, a B vitamin, but it contains all of the pieces of complete protein. If you're an animal like a cow or a llama that chews its cud and sends all the plant matter it consumes through multiple rounds of digestion in multiple stomach chambers, you can get at all the goodies. But if you are a human with an exclusively one-way digestive tract and a single stomach, then you need some help. The help is that alkaline soak at something around pH 11. This alkaline soak is now generally known as nixtamalization, a word constructed from the Aztec language roots for ashes and unformed corn dough. How the advantages of processing corn with a basic solution were first realized is unknown. But as Dr. Rachel V. Briggs from the University of North Carolina points out, there are multiple separate instances of alkali processed foods around the world. Scandinavian lutefisk, Chinese pidan, also known as century eggs, and the olives of the Mediterranean. So clearly this has been discovered multiple times. Two prevailing hypotheses of how are out there. Wood ash got mixed into a clay pot of dried corn, either while hanging out for a pre-cooked soak or during the cooking, or at a time when vessels were not sturdy enough for prolonged exposure to direct flames, that is, before fired pottery. Fire-heated rocks, in this case limestone, were dropped into the cooking vessel to heat and cook dry corn in water. Modern tests have shown that heating water to boiling for long enough to cook dried corn with hot limestone chunks can bring the water up to the needed pH and produce the nixtamalization reaction. However it happened, the people doing this certainly noticed that corn treated this way grinds into a creamier dough that hangs together better and is easier to work. We know it as fresh masa. And the whole kernels treated this way lose the hard outer shell. They're much softer to chew when cooked through and give a nicer body to stews. An alkaline treatment would also stop the grains from sprouting in storage because it kills the seed's germ and would prevent a range of molds and mildews, or at least destroy any toxins they left behind during their invasion. Finally, anyone subsisting largely on corn would simply feel better and would have more energy because they have access to the whole suite of corn's nutrients. In Central and South America and the Southwest, the alkaline used was a combination of mined calcium hydroxide, or Cal, soaked hot limestone rocks, and solutions made with wood ashes, leached potassium hydroxide, typically called lye. All of these methods produce liquids with a noticeable slippery feel. It feels sort of soapy and a distinctively bitter taste. So even without a pH strip, people had ways of testing to see if the solutions were strong enough to do the job. Where there was no local cal or limestone deposits, the practice of soaking or cooking the corn with ashes or in lye water took over entirely, and hardwood ash was preferred. The practice of grinding wet soaked kernels to make masa on a stone metate stopped traveling with the corn as it left the Southwest, but eating the whole kernels as hominy and grinding the dried, lye-soaked kernels to make grits and flour traveled on. In the 1,200 years or so, the East Coast tribes had to adopt corn and adapt it to their lands and food traditions. A wide range of dishes, preparation, and storage techniques grew up. Rachel Briggs even uses some cool math to demonstrate that within Mississippian culture, particular pots were likely constructed for separately soaking the corn and then cooking the corn. And there are plenty of ways the stalks and husks made it into daily life, as poles, kindling, woven mats, baskets, and even the material for toys. You've seen corn husk dolls, right? This was the complex and stable corn culture the English were just about to blunder into. So join me next week as Tisquantum finally makes it back to the Patuxet lands after his 5-year odyssey, and we get to see how corn shaped the colonial experience from Maine to the Carolinas. Thanks for listening. Show notes for this episode will be at thehistoryofamericanfood.blogspot.com. Along with any promised pictures and links, I'll also include any interesting media I use for the episode. You can leave comments about this episode there as well. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle. The link to the show notes is also in the show's Twitter bio @THOA Food and in the show description.